Should women be silent in church? Well, that's what we're going to talk about today. Man, let me tell you, we are getting into some controversy today. We are opening up a can of worms today. We are going to see the hate mongers in the comments come out today, and it's just going to be an absolute bloodbath, which is actually pretty cool because sometimes when you deal with these controversial issues and you read the comments, it's actually quite entertaining because sometimes people just say like some really cool stuff. Hateful, of course, but they're really cool. Anyways, we are going to be talking about whether or not women should be silent in churches. And before we get too far into this video, I just want to tell you something very important. This is an issue that you need to split, right? So let's just say that there's an imaginary line here in the middle of the screen, right? We have an issue on this side and we have an issue on that side. So what are those two issues? Well, first of all, there is the issue of what Paul actually said. So that would be over here. Then, keep in mind, there's an imaginary line here. Then there's the issue of what the church believes, what the modern church believes, that is. Okay, so those are two entirely different problems. So when we ask the question, should a woman be silent in church or should they be quiet in church, you have to understand there's two answers. There's what the modern church is saying, and then there's what Paul says. They are not the same answers. They are not the same thing. It's very crucial to understand what I actually mean by that. But before we get too far into this video, I want to tell you about my YouTube channel and why I think you should subscribe. First of all, this is a Bible study channel. What do we do here? We study the Bible because we take the Bible seriously and we seriously study the Bible. So if you're looking for a really great Bible study that is online, that's absolutely free, you just found it and you can go ahead and click subscribe and the bell notification because I publish a brand new video every single day. Oh, and by the way, I forgot to tell you, my name is Adam Jordan Clark and I make these videos, publish them every day, and we try to talk about some really cool stuff. So we also try to talk about stuff from a different perspective that you probably aren't hearing somewhere else or that you're not hearing in church. I mean, we actually make it a point to not talk about stuff that people are talking about in church. So just understand the answer that you're going to get in this video or the explanation is not going to be what you're going to get in church. That's kind of like the theme that we go here, what we do on this channel is we start talking about stuff that your church is not talking about. So be sure to watch this video all the way to the end. Also, let me tell you about this problem of the modern church. Again, just imagine there's a line in the middle of your screen, and over here we got Paul and what he said, and then we have the modern church. What you must understand is that the modern church is 2,000 years old. It's 2,000 years in the future, guys. I mean, seriously, we live in the 21st century. The 21st century. I mean, we have cars, we have airplanes, we have buses, we have boats, we have ships, we have electricity, we got Starbucks with Starbucks cops. We even have the coronavirus, okay? That's a hot topic right now. All right, so our world is completely different from what it was 2,000 years ago. Back in those days when Paul's writing these letters and Jesus is walking around on earth, guys, seriously, they didn't have airplanes, they didn't have cars, they didn't have electricity. I mean, you just go down the list. Your world that you live in today is nothing like the world that existed there. So you must understand something. Our view of women in America is sort of, we could probably call it feminism of some sort, but our view of women and men is that they're equal. Right? Men and women can vote. They can go to the stores. They can both have jobs. They can go to college and yada, yada. I mean, we don't really have a discriminatory relationship between men and women, if you will. We're just kind of like, okay, they can do whatever women can do the same thing men want to do. And so because that's our culture, what do? We say, well, men are pastors, therefore women can be pastors. That's what we do. We do not say, we don't put an if there. We don't say, well, men are pastors, But if the Bible says it's okay, then therefore women can be pastors. That's not how we rationalize it. What we do is we say, look, men are pastors, therefore women can be pastors. It's very crucial to understand that. Why? Here's why. The church at large in America believes that women should be pastors or can be pastors or teachers or prophets or evangelists or whatever type of ministry they want to be involved in. They can do it because that's what the church believes. There are a handful of denominations that don't believe that. They do not ordain women, but most of them do. Okay, most churches are like, oh, okay, you're a woman pastor. That's cool. It's cool with us. We don't care. They don't even see it as an issue. This is all right, whatever, woman pastor, it's cool. So that's what the church believes. And guess what, guys? In case you didn't know, the church is still going to continue believing that. Americans who go to church in America are most definitely not going to have a problem with women speaking in churches. That's number one. Number two, they're not going to have a problem with them being pastors. That's never going to change, okay? So, understand that problem. If we're asking the question, should women speak in churches or should women be pastors or be silent in churches, understand the church has already answered this question. They've already said it's okay. There's nothing wrong with it. Okay? Pure and simple. Now, we got this other problem over here, which is this Apostle Paul dude. He's got one letter that we know of. But there are two places in the New Testament that talk about women being silent. That's 1 Corinthians and 1 Timothy. They're explicit passages. They very clearly say women should be silent in churches. Let me show you what I mean. On the left-hand side of your screen, you can see 1 Corinthians. On the right-hand side of your screen, you can see it says 1 Timothy. Here is what 1 Corinthians has to say. Women should be silent in the churches. They are not allowed to speak, but must be in submission as the law says. That's what 1 Corinthians says. Here's what 1 Timothy says. I do not permit a woman to teach or to assume authority over a man. She must be quiet. So, it's pretty, case closed. All right, it's time to go home. I thought that was funny. Look, this is where things get a little bit complicated. All right, so we got these two passages. We have 1 Corinthians and 1 Timothy. Right? So we're going to get real technical. It's okay. Just sit back, relax. I'm going to explain it in a simple way. There are 7 letters that all scholars agree Paul wrote. Okay? That's 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Romans, Philemon, Philippians, Galatians, and Romans. All scholars agree that he wrote those letters. Disputed letters are, Colossians and Ephesians, 1st and 2nd Timothy, and Titus. A lot of scholars are like, dude, he probably did not write 1st and 2nd Timothy or Titus. Okay? So some scholars do affirm that he did write that, but a lot of scholars don't think that he wrote 1st or 2nd Timothy. So given the fact that one of our passages on our screen here says 1 Timothy, that means that this probably was not written by Paul. So we have to ask the question, how did this stuff get here? Well, the answer to that question is very simple. Whoever wrote Timothy is probably a follower of Paul. If it was not Paul, it was probably his follower. And they knew his teaching about women. And so therefore they said, wait a second, we got to put this teaching about women in our book. So what did they do? They put it in their book. No matter how you cut the cake, though, 1 Timothy is most definitely representing an authentic teaching of Paul, which is what? Women should be silent in church. How do we know that? We know that because 1 Corinthians is definitely an authentic letter of Paul. So basically what it says is women should remain silent in churches. They are not allowed to speak, must be in submission as the law says. Now, when Paul wrote his letters back in the day when he was writing, understand something, okay? Paul didn't actually write his letters by himself. I know that's what a lot of people think because that's what our pictures tell us. They say, Paul's writing down. That didn't happen. When Paul wrote his letters, he used secretaries, or scribes, if you will, and he dictated his letters. What does dictation mean? Here's what it means. Paul was sitting in a room, okay, and he was talking out loud, just like I'm talking to you. He was talking to a person who was a scribe or a secretary. They had a pen and piece of paper, and they were writing down everything that he said. Okay? So, that's what happened. How do we know that? Well, because some of his letters give evidence of this. For example, Romans chapter 16. It says, I, Tertius, who penned this letter, greet you in the Lord. So obviously Tertius is one of his scribes. Timothy was also probably one of his scribes as well. So that's another reason why he probably didn't write 1 Timothy, because that doesn't make any sense. So what I'm trying to tell you is very, very, very simple. 1 Corinthians is probably a letter that's written by Paul. And you have to understand something about this writing process with scribes. By the way, a lot of my research that I'm doing right now for my PhD is focused on letter writing, actually. I'm very much interested in letter writing. So I have spent some time, dabbling around in this area. I'm not an expert yet, but I know a little bit. So what I'm trying to tell you is that when these people were writing, copying these letters from Paul, his secretaries, first of all, you have something called longhand and you have something called shorthand. Longhand is when they wrote every single word exactly, and then you had shorthand. Well, the first problem we have to deal with is, why did Paul have secretaries? Well, he had secretaries because he was probably blind. So we had obviously raised the question, well, if he was blind and he couldn't write his own writings, how could we possibly suspect that he would be able to edit his own writings? Okay, so we got ourselves a little bit of, we don't really know a whole lot about that, actually. We're kind of like a little bit confused. I mean, there's lots of stuff that doesn't make sense. But what we do know about Paul writing letters is that he probably, or at least I think that he had a team of people. It wasn't just one scribe. He probably had a bunch of scribes together. And they got in a room and said, let's write this letter. So you have to understand, when you're reading passages like this, it's not just one person writing these words. Instead, it's a collaboration. And what happens with this collaboration is a lot of thoughts. They're not just writing these words. And what's amazing about these words, or at least I think what is amazing about these words, is that they seem to just be written normally. In other words, it's like if I were to ask you, what is today? And you were to say, well, today's Monday. I mean, you just say it normal. I mean, it wouldn't be something that you would put a lot of thought into. When you read this passage, it actually reads that same way, where it's like, okay, it doesn't really seem like there's a lot of thought that went into this. It actually just kind of seems like, just a wave of the hand, like it was normal, I guess you could say. It was a normal thing. And so if that were the case, it was probably a good representation of what Paul believed. Furthermore, we have some good evidence in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, just a couple of chapters before 14. And he talks about men and women and this relationship between men and women. And what he describes is something very important. He describes God being above man and man being God's most glorious possession or glorious creation. He also describes a woman as being the glory of a man. In other words, it's like this. God is in control of man, and man is in control of woman. So therefore, a woman should be in submission to a man as man is in submission to God. That's this relational element between God, man, and woman that Paul describes in 1 Corinthians 11. Well, if that's what he believes, and he probably did believe that, by the way, we have other places in the New Testament that paint the same picture of women. We also have Genesis, this is where it all traces back to, Genesis, where God creates man and then creates a woman out of man. So basically, woman is lesser than man, so therefore she's in submission to man, as man is in submission to God. This is pretty evidential. I mean, there's a lot of evidence in the Bible to say that this is what early people thought. This is what Jews thought. And Paul was a Jew, by the way, and he's teaching a lot of Judaism, even though it's Christian. It's still Judaism. So basically what I'm trying to tell you is that Paul most definitely believed that women should be silent in church, at least for that church. The church at Corinth, he's writing a letter to him. He says women should be silent in the churches. The problem is that it says churches, right? It just doesn't say in that church, it says churches. So if there's ever a point of controversy, that would probably be where it is. What does he mean by church? Does he mean that church, or does he mean all of the churches? How do we actually interpret this passage? Furthermore, let me tell you this. What do you do about the gifts of the Holy Spirit? Right? He gives these instructions. Are the instructions only for that church, or are they for all the churches? How can you be hermeneutically sound? How can you be consistent? Well, the modern church really doesn't have answers to these types of questions because they're too hard questions to answer. And quite frankly, they just haven't gotten there yet. Why haven't they gotten there yet? Well, because they've solved the problem. What problem? Well, here's what I'm trying to tell you. Going back to this line on the center of your screen, you have Paul and what he wrote, and then you have the church. The church says, look, we don't have a problem with women being pastors, so therefore they can be pastors because we don't see it as an issue. So women are pastors in churches, right? But Paul, on the other hand, he's like, no, women should be silent in churches. That's what he says. They're pretty authentic words from Paul. Probably a good representation of what he taught and what he believed. We have a second letter that was written by one of his followers who are replicating what he taught. So they even thought that this was Paul's authentic teaching. So that's an even bigger problem, right? What I'm trying to tell you is that Paul most definitely taught at some level that women should be silent in churches. Now, what are the details of that? Was it one church? Was it 10 churches? Was it all the churches? Was it a cultural thing? Was it only dealing with certain issues? Was it only on certain things? Does this being silent in church speak? Because if you notice, you come back here and you look at this passage, it doesn't say anything about pastoring. It doesn't say anything about teaching or any of that stuff, at least in these words. It just says women should be silent. It does go on to talk about some other issues, but this is, the big meat of it. Basically, what I'm trying to say is very simply, Paul believed that women should be silent in churches. That's what he taught. That's what he believed. I'm 100% confident in that. Now, does that actually matter to the modern church? Well, no, it doesn't. So, I think this is a great illustration for us, because what it shows us is that people don't actually believe the Bible. They just don't. And all the people who come out and say, oh, this is not what Paul meant, they make arguments of quotation or something like that. Whatever. It's quite silly argumentation, I think. But people who make these arguments, they say Paul agreed with women and they should be in authority and power and blah, blah, blah. First of all, that's extremely hard to argue. That's the biggest problem. Second biggest problem is that, does it even matter? I mean, does it really even matter? The modern church has shown it doesn't care. So this isn't even an issue. I mean, realistically, at the end of the day, guys, this is not an issue. It's not an issue for anybody. Because the modern church is going to say, hey, look, you know what? Women can be pastors, they can be teachers, and it does not matter. So, it's really an issue of the authority of the Bible. Should we follow the Bible down to a T? It also says in the Old Testament, thou shalt not murder. That's an Old Testament commandment. Well, we're under the New Testament. We're under the New Covenant. Should we still follow the Old Testament? Does this mean that we can go out and kill people and lie and cheat and steal and do all that bad stuff in the Bible that in the Old Testament says we shouldn't do it? Well, I don't know. These are questions of authority. And unfortunately, the church has definitely demonstrated that it doesn't really care too much about the Bible's authority. And it's not going to care. Okay, that's something you really need to understand. There's not going to be another Reformation, guys. Okay, I think it's safe to say that there's not going to be another Reformation. There's not going to be another Martin Luther. I think that we really need to start talking about new things here. I think we really need to start talking about the reality of the church in a very real way and stop talking about stuff that happened 500 years ago. There's not going to be another Reformation. There's not going to be another Martin Luther. The problems that we're dealing with in our church today is way more advanced than what Martin Luther was dealing with in the Protestant Reformation. And we're going to have some serious problems rolling out into the next 80 years, 100 years of the church, for 21st century, that is. My name is Adam Jordan Clark, and if you like this video, go ahead and give it a thumbs up, and don't forget to comment below and tell me something interesting or maybe a cool story, and don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell notification because I publish a brand new video every single day. My name is Adam Jordan Clark, and as always, I will see you in the next video.